To be here. Thanks to the Strategy Institute for inviting us to speak. So as you heard, I'm Kendall. I'm Associate Director of Strategy at NICE. I'll just give a bit of context about NICE. I'm sure you're familiar, but setting out some of our current priorities, and then focus on international collaboration in HTA, some general factors, and some of the areas that NICE is focused on currently. So just briefly on NICE, I'm sure you all know, but just the key things to note are we are the HTA agency for England. We also have a role in some other UK nations other than Scotland, and we appraise all new medicines, new active substances, and significant license extensions. So any drug which is made available on the NHS basically needs to be appraised by NICE. If it's positively appraised, then it comes with a funding mandate and has to be made available and funded. We also make optimized recommendations where it's a more limited population than the licensing. And we have the Cancer Drugs Fund and Innovative Medicines Fund, which are managed access funds where we can make a recommendation for further evidence generation while patients have access to treatments before a subsequent reappraisal based on that real-world evidence. We also do health technologies, about 100 and so a year, and clinical guidelines, both of which I won't really focus on today, but there's a couple of areas that might come up. So, just as a bit of context, I'm sure you're all aware the health system is changing. There's a lot going on. So in the UK particularly, there's very extreme operational pressures on the NHS right now, alongside that funding pressures. So there's a lot of pressure on making the best use of NHS funds and also on trying to reduce burdens on staff. So there's clearly a role for NICE there, both in how we appraise things and how we directly work with staff and support them. There's wider changes too, like more focus on shared decision-making, so rather than a clinician telling a patient what they should get, it's more of a discussion. So there's a range there of how we can support those conversations in providing decision support tools and providing guidance which can be accessible to patients and clinicians. And then there's the huge growth in innovation, lots of promising, exciting stuff coming through, can benefit patients, can benefit the system. Some of it's also quite hard to implement for various reasons, either because of the complexity or the scale or the cost. And then just the huge amounts of data which are now available to inform our appraisals, real-world data as well as the trial data from more and more sources and the means to analyze that. So NICE needs to change too. So our mission remains the same, which is to get the best care to patients fast while ensuring value for the taxpayer. But we need to evolve in three ways. So firstly, we're trying to be more timely and easy to use in our guidance. So that means making decisions more quickly. In medicines, we peg our decision-making to marketing authorization. So we're trying to reduce the days taken between marketing authorization and NICE's decision. Health tech is a bit different and guidelines is a bit different, but in all cases, we're trying to shorten those things. And also to make our products more accessible. So we've changed the way that we structure and publish our content. So rather than these big, long PDFs that no one's going to read, we're trying to make things disaggregated in different ways, can be read by third-party systems, more useful for people who are actually reading our guidance. Then on relevance, we're clear to focus on what matters most. So for medicines, it's not so important because, as I mentioned, we look at everything. But for health tech and for guidelines, we kind of choose which products we look at. And we're increasingly incorporating our medicine recommendations into our clinical guidelines. So the areas we choose does have wider impacts. And what we heard from the system is that there's too much out there. We have more than 25,000 guideline recommendations. It's too much for us to keep up to date. It's too much for people to read. So we're moving to a more focused portfolio, focused on things which are important for patients from an epidemiological perspective, as well as from a health system operational perspective. And then focused on impact. So we need to collect more data on how our products are used, how people follow our advice, and then we can use that to feed into the way we develop things and the way we support their implementation. So let's run through a couple of highlights. I'm not wearing my glasses, so I can't really read that, but I know that we are 45% faster in our new methods and processes. So for the less complex medicines, we can now appraise them in a light touch model, which is, as I say, up to 45% faster. And for example, we've now, for the first time, published guidance on 2 medicines within 24 hours of their marketing authorization last year. So we'd never done that before, and we did it twice in 1 year. We've launched our new prioritization board and prioritization framework for how we choose guidance. We're building a new horizon scanning function, which I'm setting up. And we relaunched our NICE Advice, which is a service for industry to provide scientific advice and commercial advice, etc. And that resulted in an increase in referrals by more than 80%. And we started more actively measuring the uptake of NICE guidance in priority topics. So the idea being we can track how people are following our guidelines and following medicine recommendations across the country. You can look at regional variation. You can use that data to support implementation both from NICE and from our health system partners. And other key achievements, so on medicine's timeliness, there's a category of appraisals which we call optimized appraisals, where all the conditions are met so that NICE can follow our processes, so external factors go in the way that we've set out. And in those cases, the average time from marketing authorization to HTA decision is only 36 days, so quite short. And probably won't focus on the rest of those things, but outside of the pharma space, digital health is obviously a huge area. Growing interest. Our appraisal program is now 30 times bigger than it was a few years ago. We're trying to signal to the NHS which digital products make sense to use. We've made recommendations for hybrid closed-loop technologies for diabetes. More than 150,000 patients can benefit from that. That comes with a funding mandate as well. And we're making use of evidence in different ways. So real-world evidence was used in more than 95% of our guideline health economic models. So what's for this year? Same sort of focus. Those three areas remain our guiding star. That's in our transformation plan, which we published a couple of years ago. So this year, continuing to focus on timeliness, reducing the time we take to make decisions. We're investing more in our HTA lab. So that's kind of methodological experts who figure out how we can appraise these new complex technologies that might need further work. And that's something we'll touch on in the international collaboration space as well. We're focusing on integrating horizon scanning, so looking further ahead, also relevant to international HTA with our topic selection and prioritization. And we're measuring uptake and involving people and communities in our guidance development in different ways. So that sets out some of the context for what we're focusing on now and some of the bigger systemic issues that we face as a country and as NICE. So how does that feed into international collaboration? Well, first of all, I'll say why should we collaborate, and then some of the factors that drive that, and some examples of collaboration. Actually, just going to put my timer on because I'm not paying attention to how long I'm speaking for. So first of all, as you mentioned, some of the HTA paradigms are challenged by what's going on. So partly that's things like regulatory changes. Since the UK left the European Union, the MHRA are doing more and more international reliance routes. That changes how we have visibility of upcoming treatments. There are different levels of data and expectations in different regulators, so that changes how HTA agencies make their decisions. But also there's new treatments emerging which challenge our appraisal processes that might need further work, or just very large volumes of treatments as well, which require capacity, or products which are very kind of cost-effective but challenging to implement, maybe because of their scale. So for that, we might need more research and evidence on delivery models. You might have seen that the UK government partnered with Eli Lilly on a tirzepatide kind of rollout and data collection to look at the kind of societal impacts of that. There's areas like that where you want to understand the delivery models and longer-term impacts, and you can only do that if you start looking earlier in the chain. Many of these challenges are shared across different HTA agencies, so we can share our experiences and learning and just figure out how we tackle these challenges. We all have resource constraints. As I mentioned, the NHS is under great pressure, but that applies to the wider public sector too. Even the best resourced HTA agencies can't do everything they want, so it's helpful to share learning and collaborate. And related, different agencies have different areas of expertise, so there's no point in NICE trying to build a new area of expertise when we know that the CDA does it fantastically, so we can ask them for their reflections first. And importantly, if we get it right, then we can support timely access to clinically and cost-effective medicines for patients, and we can support industry by streamlining things, reducing burdens, and giving clear expectations. So some of the kind of context for shapes why and how we collaborate are kind of important to note. So I think the key thing here is collaboration in HTA is not like collaboration as a regulator. So regulatory collaboration is very well established. There's agencies like the EMA who do it on behalf of all of Europe. There are initiatives like Orbis and Access that the UK is a part of as well, when that's based on global clinical trials. In HTA, national features are much more significant. So that really shapes the way that you can collaborate effectively. So there's local health system differences. So we have different clinical pathways, we have different resourcing models, we have different staff costs, we have different other costs, we have different real-world evidence. All these things are inputs to the HTA, and they really define the question. If you're comparing like for like, then you can't collaborate on answering that question very effectively. There's a different role and approach for HTA in different countries. We use different methods for one thing. If you're doing clinical cost-effectiveness, if you're doing cost-effectiveness analysis in one place and added benefit in another place, then that's a whole different approach which can't be directly compared. And then there's the role of HTA. So, as I mentioned, where NICE makes a decision, it comes with a funding mandate. The medicine has to be made available to the NHS. Elsewhere, it might be advisory, or they have different statuses. So it's not clear how one decision relates to another area. And then finally, HTA is not purely algorithmic. The methods we use are linked to national priorities and values. So we have different ways that in our methods we account for things like severity. We used to account for end of life. You can account for childhood or rarity in different ways. These are all based on what different societies value, and that's different in different places. So again, these are not universally transferable. So all of that means is that if everyone to collaborate equally, each agency would then have to redo so much of the work that it becomes kind of nugatory anyway. So you need to carefully choose the areas in which people collaborate to make sure it's valuable for each partner. So that means HTA collaborations vary very widely in what they look like. So for one type, there's the AusCan and ZUK collaboration, which is Canada and Quebec, the UK home nations, Australia and New Zealand. So that started in COVID as a kind of informal collaboration, was formalized in 2022, and it's a kind of information sharing and cooperation on certain areas. And we've looked at work sharing, methods, and kind of operational lessons, but it's fairly informal, more about information sharing, really. You can go further than that. I'm sure many of you are interested in the EU HTA, launching, I think, in January. So they're going to start doing joint clinical assessments from January. Just to be clear, I'm not very close to that. We're not a part of that. The UK is not allowed to be a part of that under the terms of the EU exit. So it's starting up soon, but we're not involved. And then you can go further again. There's some initiatives like Benelux, so it's Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, but also Ireland and one or two other places, and they can share the full HTA, including the economics. So it's unusual to go that far, but they can. Clearly, if there's enough similarities in the health system and the values and the costs, then you can go that far, but most places don't do that. So some of the areas that NICE does collaborate, we have bilateral relationships with many similar agencies. We're very friendly with Canada, with similar kind of countries, similar approaches, so we can share lessons there. There's the USA, very different health system, different model with ISA, but again, they've got some really great expertise in many areas, so they're useful to collaborate with, as well as many European nations, as well as and Australia, New Zealand, etc. So there's bilateral, where we'll kind of talk about shared issues. Currently, everyone's figuring out how you can roll out medicines to large populations, that sort of thing. There's the multilaterals like AusCan and ZUK. And then there's networks that we're a part of, HJI, etc., where they'll come together, and that's more kind of academic and technical focuses usually, where people will share poster presentations, etc., and talk about methods development, data types, and analytical approaches. And then there's international research collaboratives. So NICE is often part of the generally EU-funded collaboratives, for example, Sustain HTA, looking at the future of HTA, where, again, our kind of methodological experts will get together with others, look at emerging issues, health economic methods developments, etc., and see how we can bring them together into our approaches. So our main focus, as I set up before, there's so many differences in health systems, national priorities, and methods and so on that really shape how far you can collaborate. So from the NICE side, the area that we are focusing on currently is basically pre-evaluation activities, where it's more straightforward to collaborate and share because it's not so dependent on these local factors. So that's horizon scanning, aligning methods and positions where possible, and supporting industry directly on evidence generation plans. So I'm just going to touch on those three areas individually. So first of all, horizon scanning. So why do we want to collaborate on horizon scanning? Well, there's a lot going on. Some of it's quite hard for agencies to deal with, either because we need new methods or we need to bring people in, or we need to understand the rollout implications, as I mentioned. So having a shared understanding of what those medicines are is helpful. We can do things earlier, we can commission work, these things take time. So currently, NICE's formal process starts about 2 years out for the scheduling and analysis and so on. We're starting to look further ahead now. As I mentioned, I'm setting up a small team which is looking more like 2 to 5 years out to understand the kind of emerging innovations that might be disruptive for NICE or the health system, to make sure we're laying in place things to enable a timely appraisal and therefore appropriate access. Other agencies are doing the same. There is a European kind of cross-country horizon scanning agency as well. So we can get together and share the pipeline that we're looking at and try and flag anything that we think might need further investigation. And this is just through informal information sharing, really. We can share our pipelines. There's lots of public information about what's out there. There's obviously commercial sources that probably many of you use to see what's in development. So we can use that and have our own interpretations, understand what might be an issue for the UK health system and for others. So, for example, this is actually not arising from international collaboration, but when the first histology-independent cancer drugs came through, we noticed that they're going to be very hard for NICE to appraise under the previous methods, under the kind of established methods. There's much more kind of heterogeneity in outcomes. So we commissioned an external academic group to do some methods work so we could understand how we could appraise them. We set up a committee. We essentially ran a full kind of mock appraisal of a kind of imagined medicine of this type, so we can make sure that when they did come through, we'd be ready to appraise it. So we don't necessarily always need to go that far, but for many of these medicines, we did some work recently in our HJ lab, for example, to understand how we would appraise the new dementia medicines coming through. There'll be others coming through. So our HJ lab programs are all on the website, so you can see if you're interested. They're not all about medicines, but many of them are. And that's basically a bunch of very clever people get together and they figure out how we can deal in a technical sense with these medicines so that when it comes through, we can do our appraisal as quickly as possible and grant access. So next one, so methods and positions. So this is an area where we see benefits for industry and patients in just providing clarity on what we think about certain issues, and where these are global issues that don't relate to individual methodological decisions. So we can kind of agree a consensus on key problems that are internationally relevant, get together and figure out how we'll deal with them as agencies, publish that, and give clarity for industry and others on how we'll deal with these issues. And this tends to be time-limited working groups, so kind of task and finish type programs that will identify an issue, bringing together partners who have that same issue. So it won't be necessarily everyone. We have kind of different dynamic networks coming together, the ones who share these same issues, figure out our position, and then we can publish that. So for an example of a recent one we've concluded is our position on academic and confidence data, but more coming up now at ISPOR, we'll be publishing a multi-agency consensus recommendations on the use of surrogates. So this came out as something we recognized, given the regulatory changes where more and more surrogates are being used for marketing authorizations, that has challenges for HTA because of sometimes the uncertainty in the link between the surrogate and the endpoint, and therefore the cost effectiveness is not established. But we recognize that medicines are being approved on this basis, so we need to do something about it. It's in no one's interest if companies spend a lot of time and money running clinical trials which aren't going to be appropriate for an HTA. We want to make sure that that's smooth. It reduces your cost burden, it reduces time, it enables patient access. So we got together with a bunch of other partners, including Canada, the US, and 4 or 5 others, to say, okay, what's our position on the use of surrogates in submissions? So that will be published soon, and hopefully that will inform your plans in future. Other related areas, the UK's, the MHRA have started using international recognition procedures for regulation more frequently as well, based on named regulators, including the FDA. And we know that the FDA has different standards of evidence than the EMA or the MHRA would do ordinarily. So there was a worry that companies would come through with FDA approval, come for the international reliance procedure by the MHRA, but they wouldn't have the right evidence for a NICE submission, so it wouldn't really add to it, actually help with anything. So we published some guidance on the website about the implications of the international recognition procedure for submissions to NICE. That's just about NICE, but you get the idea that there are things where we can provide clarity for industry so you don't waste time, money, and effort on studies which don't add benefit. And then finally, parallel scientific advice. So this is something that NICE and the CDA have been doing for a few years, where we'll get together and do a joint engagement with companies about your evidence generation plans and provide advice about that. So it's a single report from both organizations, as well as a separate detailed report from the CDA and from NICE. And the idea is that that can inform evidence generation so that you can do, one set of studies, one submission, or not one submission exactly, but you'll be confident that your evidence generation plan can be applicable both for Canada and for NICE. Again, kind of streamlining things, reducing time and effort. And we've had very positive comments from companies that this has been really helpful in their submissions. So finally, just, I guess, summary and key messages. Well, HTA has a lot of jurisdiction-specific factors. It's never going to be as deep collaborations as in regulation, but there are models for effective collaboration, some deeper than others. What makes sense depends on the kind of socio-political context as much as it does on the methodological issues. So there'll be some areas where you can go quite deep, some where you can't. For NICE, we're looking at kind of pre-evaluation collaboration currently, so horizon scanning, methods, and scientific advice. We think that is really beneficial for patients, for industry, for health systems. So for yourselves, I suppose the takeaway is, if it's helpful, seek joint scientific advice. Please notify when you've got treatments coming down. So for the UK, we use UK PharmaScan, where any product should be logged there to enable market access. We need to know about things early, increasingly earlier, so we can do preparatory work. And please take note of when we publish things like position statements. They'll always be on the NICE website, of course, but also through other comms channels, and use them to inform your plans where that's appropriate. Thanks. Any questions?
So, any questions, comments? Yep, right up at the front here.
Thank you for that very much. I work for a pharmaceutical company here in Canada, and was curious about if you can speak to the timing of the how long it takes for the HTA reviews and with NICE, and then obviously the pricing negotiation component of it that happens. The full spectrum of from beginning to end. Here in Canada, we have the luxury of potentially being 2 years from post notice of compliance, HTA review, public negotiations with a separate entity, then listings in every jurisdiction, specific listing agreements. That's a 2-year process in many cases at best. So maybe you could speak to what it looks like in the UK from beginning to end, and then any insights we may adapt from that. Because again, we're in an HTA country. We're a global pharmaceutical company. We have similar issues in HTA markets. So maybe you could share some of those insights if you don't mind.
Sure. I mean, it's going to be the same issues, I'm afraid. So I can't really speak to the pre-regulatory side just because I don't really know much about it. But we will start doing the appraisals and scheduling in parallel with marketing authorization submissions. So as I say, we tend to be notified of medicines about 2 years before we need to be giving guidance, and we run the development in parallel with marketing authorization. We aim to publish guidance as quickly as possible following marketing authorization. As I mentioned, where everything goes right, that's an average of only 37 days, but that's where everything goes right. So actually that represents a fairly small proportion of all appraisals. I think the total average time between marketing authorization and NICE decision is in the region of, it's more like 150 days-ish, maybe 180. And the drivers of that delay are usually when evidence isn't ready, pricing isn't ready. If we have to have more than one committee meeting, then that's a big driver of delay. So what we often find is at the first committee meeting, the initial decision might be negative, and then following that, then there'll be new evidence, there might be a price change, second committee meeting is positive. So all these things add time and delays. NICE doesn't do price negotiations, that's NHS England, and not always needed. The complex negotiations happen when it meets a budget impact threshold of more than 20 million in the first 5 years, I think. So I think if you look at European time to access, we tend to be around 7th in speed. Obviously, Germany is really fast because they don't have pre-launch timings, and everyone else is between 110 and 200 days for the kind of top big countries. So I suppose, in terms of lessons, we've just been working on streamlining our processes and methods. I think one of the things that we try and do is segment more, so the simpler medicines we can just do cost comparison, or we can, where it's less risky, then that's one way to get those medicines through faster. But actually, the bigger driver of delay is usually when it's requested by the company because they need more time to get evidence, or they want to do some more commercial negotiations and so on. So, yeah, I can't direct our CDA friends to a different direction, I'm afraid.
Yes, in the middle here. Yeah.
Yeah, in Canada, there are some outcome-based agreements, but not much of publicly available knowledge, like what they are and how they work. I was wondering if you could speak to NICE's outcome-based agreement, how they work, and what fraction of new drugs actually undergoing those kind of agreements.
Sure. So we at NICE don't do payment models directly. We will support the NHS England on developing them. We don't tend to do outcome-based models either. It's a new thing for England as well. The favoured approach is always a simple discount, but under the voluntary scheme for, it's VPAG, which is like the voluntary scheme for pricing and branded access, and basically it's the agreement that the government has with industry on the overall expenditure limit on branded medicines, after which there's a rebate paid. So under the terms of that, the government committed to piloting some outcomes, innovative payment models, which could be a few things, but currently NHS England are developing 2 outcome-based payment models. I forget what they're for, but it's kind of tends to be for high cost, low prevalence type treatments. We will probably keep exploring that. It's not directly something that NICE is involved in. We will support them in that we will be able to provide some insights into the link between the outcome and the cost, or whatever it might be, or the levels of uncertainty and so on. But that's really like a pay-or decision, which is not us.
Any last question? Yeah. Up at the front again here. Yeah.
One of your slides mentioned that real-world evidence is incorporated into 95% of your budget impact or cost-effectiveness models. Can you speak a little bit more about what that looks like and how you're incorporating it?
So that's for guidelines, which, to be clear, so that's not for HTA. So we have a range of products. So the guidelines is more the product for clinicians to read through the steps that they should take in dealing with a different patient. So it tends to be based on a wider set of evidence. We do include cost effectiveness analysis as part of that. For HTA, I don't know the percentage where we use real-world evidence. It is more and more. We have a real-world evidence framework, which is published as well, to give guidance to developers on what good looks like or what we expect in our submissions. So do have a look at that. But the percentages, I'm not sure, I'm afraid.
And you mentioned there are thousands of guidelines. Do you have a guideline for using guidelines?
We should, yeah. We're trying to get rid of them. Well, not get rid of them, but we're trying to retire the ones which are less impactful because, as I mentioned, there's too much to keep up to date. So we just want to focus on the significant ones. And like you said, it can feel overwhelming. It does feel like you might need a guideline. Yeah.
Great. And the last little thing I want to ask you, sometimes an outsider can see things we don't see. When you look at the Canadian system, what makes you scratch your head and say, why did they do that?
I feel like you're trying to get me in trouble here.
That's fine. We're very polite people.
Well, I'm not super close to it, I suppose, as well. I mean, for us, there's always a question about where does the decision get made, and where's the most appropriate place for who needs to follow what decision-making, basically. For NICE, we try and make decisions for England, but it has some implications to other countries, but not for Scotland. I think you have a similar situation here with the regions and with Quebec, so I suppose, it's always where can you simplify decision-making, and you probably have it just as the same situation as the UK does, and maybe we both can learn from each other. Yeah.
I think we wonder where decisions get made too, so don't. Great. Thank you again. Great talk.